us once again for another session of the Community Justice Forum. I'm Donna Michelle St. Bernard, and tonight we are looking at liberation reading. We are more spread out than usual today, geographically. I myself am coming at you from the Between the Lakes Purchase, which is traditional territory of the Erie, Neutral, Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Chippewa, and most recently the Mississaugas of New Credit. Um, very, I'm very interested in sort of the proliferation of ideas around actions to take to be in solidarity, and I'm more interested in those actions being connected to ideas, not just to material, in individual material acts. And so I'm really excited to be here talking to some big thinkers about some big thinkers, and hopefully reflecting on the way that we are including these voices and these stories in our consideration of how we exist and persist and ally and make things better. Oh yeah, let's do that. Let's do that. Okay, tonight we're going to be hearing from some leaders who are readers, hosted by my bestie, Yvette Nolan. Thank you so much for joining us, all of you, and thank you for the ASL interpretation from Marcia Adolph and from Kimberly Johnson, who is with us at the moment. I'll see you in a bit, nerds.
Nerds. Ani Kwekwe, Tawal, Yvette Nadijnakas, Kiraganzi B. Nondanjaba. My name is Yvette. My people are from Kiraganzi B. Algonquin First Nation in Quebec, but I am living and working on Treaty 6 territory. That is the Saskatchewan River just over there behind me. I am currently on the Shakespeare on the Saskatchewan site where I'm co-curating the festival. And I'm grateful to be able to live and work here. I was born in this province, even though I have never lived in my mother's home territory for all the obvious reasons, some of which we'll talk about as we talk through these books today. I'd like to sort of just go around and ask there's Lori, and ask the panelists to introduce themselves, however they feel like that. And name the book that they are talking about. I asked Donna Michelle, is this like Canada Reads? And she said a little bit, but less competitive. So this is the matriarchal version of Canada Reads. And I will throw to Isidra.
Hello, my name is Isidra Cruz. I'm Cree and Mexican from George Gordon First Nation, which is in Saskatchewan on Treaty 4 territory. I currently work at Canada Council for the Arts as one of the Indigenous program officers. I am located in Ottawa on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. And I will be reading talking about Unreconciled by Jessie Wente. I think that's the jazzy part.
And throw to someone, Isidra.
Okay, Lindsay.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm Lindsay Lachance. I am from an Algonquin Anishinaabe family and am zooming in from the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe as well. I am also beside a river. Perhaps that will be a theme that we end up talking about tonight as well, something that I love talking about. So foreshadowing. And I will be talking about Leanne Batassa-Mosage Simpson's, as we have always done, Indigenous freedom through radical resistance. So I'm excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me, and I'll pass it to Lori Marchand.
Wake. Oh my goodness. Sorry, I've been having a few technical difficulties in joining for some reason. I'll say awake. Again, I'm Lori Marchand. I am Silks, but I am also joining you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe here in Ottawa, where I have the honor of serving as the managing director of Indigenous Theatre. And honored to be joining you here tonight to talk to you about my conversations with Canadians by the amazing and wonderful Lee Miracle. And then I will throw to Joelle Peters.
Joelle is not with us.
Oh no!
Yeah, Joelle had a situation today. However, howsomever, as my friends say, she did send her stuff because she couldn't be with us in person. And Donna Michelle St. Bernard, who you might know, is going to, when we talk about Joelle's selection, maybe DM, pop in now. Do I need to send you a text to tell you that?
Do you want me to start with Joelle's reading?
No, just tell us what Joelle is talking about, what you're channeling Joelle to talk about.
Joelle read Tanya Talaga's All My Relations.
And so we'll get to that bit in just a bit. Thanks, DM. You can go away again. We'll call you back when we need you. Ever nice. We're going to start with Lindsay. So we just wanted to talk about these books that matter, these books that are making change in the world. We all chose something to talk about. And so Lindsay, the prompt was to read an excerpt from the book and then talk about why this book spoke to you. And we'll go through that process with everybody. And then, but I also, we can also, this is a conversation more than a panel. So feel free to jump in at any point. Well, maybe not while Lindsay's reading her excerpt. Lindsay.
Unless you're feeling like you need to jump in, we can do a choral reading. That would be okay. But yeah, so we are looking at Leanne Batessa Mosage Simpson's, As We Have Always Done, which even the title in and of itself to me is just like breathtaking. I just love it. As We Have Always Done is to me just so meaningful and important, and already alludes to this fact that we're looking back in order to create a better now and a better future. And I love that. Just briefly to say that this book I think is amazing and is kind of like a part 2 or phase 2 of Dancing on Our Turtle's Back. So if you have read this one and you love it, you will love this too. I was gonna just say that this piece to me is like, I understand when I was reading it, and especially this chapter 2, Quay as resurgent method, which I'll share a bit of, that it seems like Leanne is talking a lot about how in her experience, she is still feeling like Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous experiences are still being marginalized in the academy and in mainstream ways of thinking. And that this piece, specifically chapter 2, is really looking at the ways that that Indigenous women are, should be seen as leaders, as experts in their own way, no matter what activity they're participating in, parenting, hunting, fishing, that these daily acts are radical. That's the radical resistance, that it's about surviving with love and resisting with humility. And so I just love the joy and the beauty that's like embedded in the power of this piece. I also find I cry a lot on Zoom. I don't know why. It's like my true softie self gets like, because I'm just like alone in my house. I don't know. So I won't cry, but I might. Okay, so this is chapter 2, Quay's resurgent method. It's the bottom of 29 and top of 30. My life as a Kwe within Anishinaabewin is method, because my people have always generated knowledge through the combination of emotion and intellectual knowledge within the kinetics of our place-based practices, as mitigated through our bodies, minds, and spirits. In fact, within Anishinaabewin, I am fully responsible for generating meaning about my life through the way I think and live. This internal work is a necessary and vital part of living responsibly and ethically within our grounded normativity. It is my sovereignty. Within this larger process, on the land, I've engaged with Anishinaabeg practices of hunting, fishing, harvesting rice and medicines, ceremony, language learning, singing, dancing, making maple syrup, parenting, and storytelling. And I've spent over a decade learning from Elder Doug Williams. I've paid great attention to my thoughts, emotions, and experiences as Kwe living at this particular point in time. And I've used this to critique settler colonialism and to generate thoughts on radical resurgent responses. I have not reacted to these emotional responses uncritically, but explored and processed them through ceremony, discussions, artistic practice, and therapeutic contexts, and with elders. This is an act of resurgence itself, centering Anishinaabeg intellect and thought through embodiment of Anishinaabeg practices, and using theory and knowledge generated to critique my current reality. This is not just experiential knowledge or embodied knowledge. It is not just individual knowledge rooted in my own perspectives and experiences with the abusive power of colonialism, because it is theoretically anchored to and generated through Anishinaabeg intelligence, and because it takes place entirely within grounded normativity, perhaps a strangulated grounded normativity, but grounded normativity nonetheless. In an entirely Anishinaabeg intellectual context, I wouldn't have to explain all this. This would be understood because it is how our knowledge systems have always worked. This is Kwe as method, generating Kwe as theorist. This is Kwe as method, generating Kwe as theorist, as we have always done. And that's the end of the excerpt.
Awesome. Thank you. It's so interesting to me that you talk about Dancing on Our Turtle's Back being the first part and this book being the second part. And of course, this song is all about me. But when I was writing medicine shows and I was stuck, I spent a lot of time in Dancing on Our Turtles' Backs. Like it was just so, and in fact, afterwards, after I sent Leanna Billy Doo saying like, thank you so much for Dancing on Our Turtles' Back. So I find it interesting that this book, not next, because there's all the other things that happened in between those two books, is the next part. Did you find, Lindsay, that this one, I felt that Dancing on Our Turtle's Back was like this, like inside of Leanne, and this one, as we have always done, is like so much more outward and inclusive of like the bigger picture, the world. I'm just guessing.
Yeah. No, I think that's totally bang on, because there are stories still in here, which I think is like a really awesome aspect of Dancing on a Turtle's Back, that it is very personal. But I think this piece is that constellation that's like pulsing, because you're right, it pulls in like other Indigenous scholars, it pulls in other artists from different communities who are having similar conversations. So the turtle's back, or the web here, is definitely more inclusive, but still always so like, I do find the theoretical aspect to be really inviting and really understanding, because some of the stories are about like tapping maple trees with family members, or going swimming, or going on a long car ride, or just very simple, like showing up at someone's house with an offer. And then that will kind of spark these conversations about like nation to nationhood, about, individual sovereignty, but also nationhood or nation to nation sovereignty. And I just like, again, love that everything is kind of grounded in relationality and joy. And that reminder, like she writes, especially at this point in time, which is just the echoes there are so nuanced for each individual. So I just find it to be so impactful. And I mean, even reading it again today, I was thinking about, as you're like, everything's about me. I'm like, everything is about you. The story's about you. But when I was doing my master's, and this was, I think, in 2010, so probably 12 years ago, she's really good at math. I was going through the ethics process at this university, and I was so excited. I felt like I had won the lottery when Yvette emailed me back and said that she would meet with me to like hear about my work and talk about her work. She's the AD of a theater company. She's directing a show. And I just was so excited, traveled to Toronto, went to meet her. We had this conversation. I was like so happy and on cloud nine. I just felt so involved and so lucky to be able to listen to this person that I respected and loved so much. And so I come back to the university, fill out the ethics form, do it all, submit the application. And, right away, the red flags start going up because apparently I had breached their ethics protocol because I had met with someone before I got the stamp of the university's approval. And so I literally went from feeling so full, so connected, so in relationship with someone, that I was literally threatened expulsion. I was threatened that my degree would be taken away, that I wouldn't be able to ever get this degree. And like, I was the first person in my family to go to university. It's always very overwhelming and very sad. So I think about that a lot when I read these kinds of texts that are saying, like, you are worth it. Your way of working is worth it. This story, this experience, that is theory, that is method, that is relationality, and it is worth it. It's worthy. It should be accepted, and it should be the norm, the same as some paperwork that was mandated for me. So that's another story that I know Yvette and I both kind of carry with us in this like demanding for change way. But I found it relevant when reading this piece and bringing it to the group today, because I think hearing Leanne talk about the difficulties she's experienced in the academy and with Western knowledge transfers, it's, I think, important to kind of share those experiences so that other folks who know it or who experience that, like, don't get lost. Like, I really could have been lost. I was like left behind for a little while there. So I'm just really happy that that didn't happen to me.
Awesome, Lindsay. Thank you. I'm happy too. And now you're a doctor. So there you go. Living in all those worlds. Speaking of living in all those worlds, how's that for a segue? Let's move on to Isidra Cruz. And Isidra's talking about Unreconciled. Yes? Isidra?
Yep. Unreconciled. I'll be reading from chapter 7, Ojibwe Enough. I have had the luck of having Jesse as a mentor through the years. I met him while working at Native Earth with Yvette, which was pretty great and formative for me. So I'll read. When I eventually did start going to U of T, spoiler, I know, The university had just opened something called First Nations House, a resource center and gathering place for Indigenous students. By that point in my life, I was eager to form my own connections with community, ones not necessarily defined by family ties, and to discover my particular place within it. First Nations House seemed like a good place to start. I dropped in a few times, but I always felt uncomfortable there, as though I didn't belong. Most of the other students had grown up in First Nations communities. They weren't from the city. I remember that during one of my visits, there was a drum circle. I didn't know how to drum or sing or speak my language or do anything, it seemed to me. Everyone was welcoming, and in retrospect, I should have spent more time there, but I couldn't get over my own embarrassment and shame. I couldn't shake that feeling. Although I was Ojibwe and deeply proud of my heritage, I wasn't Ojibwe enough. Every time we'd arrive for a visit at Serpent River, I'd have the same feeling there, though being surrounded by relatives would drive it away. I know that my insecurities trace back to things forcibly taken from my family. First in the years my grandmother spent at residential school, and afterwards as she sought to make sense of herself and her life in the wake of that trauma. Yet it's still hard not to feel them as personal failings. Even today, when I'm more connected to the broader Indigenous community than at any other time in my life, it still comes over me from time to time. Self-consciousness and shame in not knowing my language, in not having grown up on the reserve and as part of the community. Knowing on an intellectual level that none of that is my fault or my mother's, grandmother's, or great-grandparents', that it's a desired outcome of centuries of colonialism doesn't make the pain and confusion much easier to bear, but it is worth writing here.
Awesome.
And
Thank you. Go, Isidra.
I was just gonna say, I think this, that feeling that he feels and he's explaining, it's something a lot of us feel. As somebody who also grew up in a urban setting, that sort of imposter syndrome. And right now with our call in, call out culture, depending on how you look at it, set the glass, I think it has really, it highlights really sort of how colonialism has affected how we look and deal with each other. And that's problematic, is that, as we talk about decolonizing institutions and decolonizing our society, we're still very much playing into this colonial structure that you are not enough or your blood quantum. And so I think that's something resonates.
Yeah, my university here, University of Saskatchewan, where I'm doing my master's in public policy in the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy, has just come down with new rules about who's Indigenous enough. And I got an award last year as an Aboriginal scholar, as an Indigenous scholar, but I would not be eligible this year because I don't have the documentation. I'm not C31. I don't have a status card. Both my brothers and my mother, both my brothers do and my mother did because they applied for status. But it's I've spent my whole, and because I never grew up in my community for all the obvious reasons, residential school and, day school and tuberculosis. But we've internalized that so much that it's I was surprised at how, when I read Unreconciled, at how much Jesse expressed that thing that so many of us feel, because that was not my sense of him when I met him at Native Earth. He's the guy who hired me at Native Earth. And
he just carries himself with so much, confidence. And
absolutely.
reading the book, you just sort of get insight into the deeper side of who Jesse is and what has formed him.
Yeah, that's just like me. So none of us have escaped it, or have we? you know, or have we? Like, has someone escaped that sort of poison?
I don't know. I guess I'm a bit of a pessimist. I'm like, I don't think we have. I don't think any of us, unfortunately, have escaped this idea of blood quantum. And in fact, we've internalized it so much that we're doing harm to our own community. You know, like you've dedicated your life to being an Indigenous artist because that is who you are. But all of a sudden, the university says you're not enough. Like, what the? And like, it's a colonial institution. This is not how our people learned things or went through life prior to colonization. But all of a sudden, the colonizers saying, "Hey, you're not Indigenous enough." Again.
And it's all of the things that are like, it's not done maliciously. I think it's, you know, like it's being done in to try and address a thing. It's the same with the Kamloops powwow, right? Like things being put in place in order to address a perceived need that then just do further damage.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm also interested, unreconciled, at how popular it is. Like everyone I know has read it or is reading it. And that to me is both shocking and not shocking. Like it's that thing about specifics being universal. Like everyone I know is reading it, not just Indigenous folks.
Yeah.
Everybody, which is fascinating to me in terms of, well, it's got it right in the title, right? We're in reconciliation mode now. And so therefore a book that's called Unreconciled maybe is people are looking to it for a key.
Yeah. And hopefully like all these people who are reading it, who are not part of the Indigenous community, or those who are, you know, really get to sort of see the experiences of somebody even as prominent as Jesse Wente, that this was his experience in this world, you know, going to good school, like private schools, all of this. He was still this outsider, both in, you know, his own community, Indigenous community, but also in, you know, the greater society. And I think because he has like this, you know, approachability, this, you know, far reach across, you know, across communities, I think, you know, people reading this book will have a better understanding of our experiences in a more, I guess, an approachable way. Like, is not saying that he, you know, fluffs it up or anything,
right?
But because they recognize him and his voice from CBC, it makes it approachable. And so he says the hard truths that we all feel, that we have lived. And he's saying those, and people not within the Indigenous community will actually hopefully get to hear these and read these stories and be like, oh, that's what you're talking about. Because I'm sure in all of your experiences, when you try and talk about these sort of things with non-Indigenous folk, you know, especially as women, we become we're angry and, you know, aggressive, and immediately people shut off. But I think what Jesse's done with this book is being able to sort of disarm people.
Yeah. Nice. Nicely put. Speaking of how we got here, I'm going to ask Donna Michelle St. Bernard to pop back in, because she's holding Joelle's book and Joelle's thoughts about Joelle's book. Yeah.
So Joelle read All Our Relations by Tanya Talaga. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. And her selection begins near the bottom of page 175. Addiction expert and BC physician Gabor Mate also points to the environment of early childhood development as a precursor to suicide. At the core of the suicide pandemic is unresolved trauma, passed from one generation to the next, along with social conditions that induce further hopelessness. The source of that multi-generational trauma is this country's colonial past and its residue in the present. The march of the history and progress Canada celebrates, from which we derive much pride and national identity, meant catastrophe for Natives, the loss of lands and livelihood and of freedom of movement, the mockery and invalidation of their spiritual ways, the near extirpation of their culture, the corruption of their intrafamilial and intracommunal relationships, and finally, for nearly 100 years, the state-sanctioned abduction, rape, physical abuse, and mental torture of their children. Quote. Joelle's added some thoughts. Joelle is sharing this with the interest of tying it in that this is where many Indigenous playwrights and artists start from with their work, the trauma. Some choose to stay in it, and Canadian audiences have and continue to pay to see it. For Joelle as a new playwright, she hopes to do a bit of this, and with her work, with her life, like, yes, this is how we got here. Now, how do we shift out of it? How do we find Indigenous joy? Step one seems to be knowing the history and acknowledging the past. And she's offered a recommendation that I will hold until is an appropriate
Hold
time.
on to your recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now that I'm listening to I read all the books, but now that I'm listening to us talk about them, I'm like, geez, maybe I curated this in the wrong order. Like, it feels like my dramaturgical brain is going like, so we started with the really hopeful one, and then we're diving backwards into how we got here. Well, that takes us another brilliant segue by Yvette Nolan to Lori Marchand to talk about her book, Lee's book.
Well, I'm going to start by saying that I loved this book. I ended up choosing it maybe because she's from the Stolo Nation, and I have a first cousin who's married into the Stolo Nation, and have family ties. Had the honor of meeting Chief Dan George, who offered to be my grandfather, and my mom and dad were at Leonard George's wedding. And it is Coast Salish, and I am, of course, of the Interior Salish, and just felt that there was likely to be something in her writing that I would recognize, and that ties in a little bit with a lot of our discussions. Now, I have to say, I was blown away. I felt like I was reading something like Khalil Gibran's The Prophet, where, speak to us on love, speak to us on marriage, speak to us on children, speak to us on cultural appropriation, speak to us on sovereignty, speak to us on language. I mean, she covers all of this, everything that we've mentioned here today, she touches on in this book in a powerful way. I absolutely recognized culturally, talking about the stoicism within the Salish nation. She talks about, not yelling, that yelling was not present traditionally in our homes, raising children with kindness. She talks about forgiveness, and I was reading about forgiveness as the Pope was traveling across our country, and remembering my dad, because very much what she says about forgiveness was reflected in what my dad used to say, which was, "Don't be sorry, just don't do it." And of course, talking about the Stolo Grandma's stare. I mean, I might refer to it as my auntie's eyebrow, but it is that cultural experience. And I have to say, because there is so much wisdom packed in, I couldn't choose just one piece. So if you'll bear with me, I have a number of just short excerpts that I'll share with you. So the first one is on, what do I call you? What should I call you? An elder gentleman invariably asks. I am Stolo, part of the Coast Salish Confederacy, was my answer. No, I mean, what do I call all of you? Answer, Stolo. No, I mean all the Indians of this land. Why do you want to know? Well, I think there is some colonial convenience in seeing us all as a single entity, a mob really, and not as separate individual nations. I'm not sure, he answered tentatively. Well, we are not crazy about dealing with you separately either. And this next piece is just a lovely little quote. So when Kevin Loring and I met 20 years ago, the things that really drew us together as friends almost immediately was talking about the type of work we wanted to create. And we talk about, and Yvette, you said it when you were out to direct, not another story about a dead Indian woman on the stage. This is about where our culture is our superpower and not our tragic flaw. And so here Lee says, you know, we have done enough voyeuristic looking at what white men did to seek out the stories we know are there in our oral repertoire and put them to the page. We need to ensure that in doing so, our young women have a place. I do that wherever I am, wherever I go, and whenever I read, write, or witness theater. I will not apologize for that. Our knowledge keepers were trained to be rememberers. They were educated to recall the significant in what is said or done. And finally, just talking about the joy and the role of art, because you know I'm going to end it on hope. So she's talking about seeing a piece that Penny Cucci and her son Sid Bob created with Anna Matagzi, with Santi Smith, that appeared at Harborfront, Agua/Water. And she says, the engagement of song and dance in the recreation of life is high art. We had high art in our past. The sort of extravagant dance productions that engage the whole community in watching an unfolding drama of song, dance, healing, ceremony, or story. This high art inspired us to something more than just getting through, just surviving. It inspired us to lead ever fuller lives. Such dance stories urged us to augment our being, to come to understand our very humanity. I always had the kind of getting through life with dance, but at the same time, I needed high art, the sort of staging of our story, the mask-based theatrical productions of those whose business was the creation of story through song and dance that would move us from survival mode to full life, to an enriched cultural being. That kind of song and dance of high art has been missing for a long time, and I did not know it was missing in my life until I saw Earth in Motion's piece. I missed it, and the missing it created this gnawing hunger for it, so deep and so all-encompassing that it filled every cell of my body. I was so full of this terrible hunger for it that it felt normal to be continuously hungry. It became so normal that I did not know life without hunger. Humans must witness the greatest artistry that their most gifted artists can create. Earth in Motion's Harborfront dance showed me how much we needed high art. This form of song, dance, its production showed me that we need high art so that we can witness the procession, the presentation, the unfolding of the drama of our lives from beginning to end in order to feel whole.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, what I love about many things I love about the book, but that she called it Conversations with Canadians, my conversations with Canadians. but it is not. It's an answer to all of the conversations she's ever had, which is so interesting to me. It's like, now you guys just listen to this. Here's my answer to all of the question, right? What do I call you? And all of the other questions. It's fascinating to me. And I also feel really lucky. This is a late book for Lee. And she left us so recently. And it was like, it's a miracle to me that this book exists.
It really is. And I did want to start by honoring, I mean, she speaks with such love of her children, and to just say that I of course sent out my heart, my love, and want to put my arms around Kalimpa and said, or the two of her three children that I know, and of course to her community and to her family who must be missing her. I mean, I think we are all missing her wisdom and brilliance at this time. But thankfully, she did leave us these words.
And so is with us always.
Exactly, which is exactly what she's talking about, right? Sharing our stories, making sure that the youth have the stories, and using digital forms to make sure that they are shareable, and to share it with honor and permission and in a cultural way, and talking about identity and claiming who we are, and that we are the ones that are in charge of deciding who our people are, who our community are, not the government. So.
Yeah. I'm going to, if there's anyone who's online, who's not in this room, who wants to comment or a question or something, you can do that by, I don't know, magic. Talk to someone in your little chat and it will get its way to us. And in the meantime, I'm going to just move through all of the speakers and ask you for a book that is not the one you read, an option. I know that before we started, Isidra was madly looking down her bookshelves. And I would encourage you to include other books. Like, these are all really great books, but hard, right? And, thinking of the joy, thinking of the love, thinking of the laughter, like all the other things that we are. And then I'm thinking of what my book is, and of course I'm breaking that rule, but regardless, I'm going back to Lindsay. Lindsay, what would be your offer?
Yay. I don't have the hard copy with me, unfortunately, but I thought about Women of the Fur Trade by Frances Tonkin, which is a play. And I'm a longtime collaborator. Frances is like one of my biggest joys, honestly. They're one of my favorite people. And I was able to be the dramaturg on this piece. I think we've worked since 2016 or 17. And yeah, I was thinking, even in the sense of liberation, I feel as though there's two major connections that made me think of it. One is this idea of liberation. And the second one, again, is one of the things I love about Leanne Simpson's writing is that Leanne talks about like things spilling out of Anishinaabeg, like love and land and rivers and knowledge and relationships just spilling out of the body. And I think that Frances has a way of writing that I would now, from reading, categorize as like spilling out and spilling over. And that makes me feel excited because it's like a new way that we can kind of talk about Indigenous plays without just saying like, it's non-linear, it was cyclical, it was all not jumbled up in my head. And so now I love this idea of like, let's try and talk about this spilling out of bodies and spilling out of notions of linear time. And so that was one rant that I had that I wanted to float to the group. And then the other one was, this idea of liberation. And so Women of the Fur Trade, it's funny because it's just recently published by Playwrights Canada Press. So you can buy it online. And when you I have bought it. So when you click on it, it says like history as one of the tags. And so I think Francis would laugh at that. And that's because the very first, I think one of the first lines, like, this play is in the 14th, 1918 something something on some bank by some red river somewhere. And so we've had this conversation in many readings and many workshops about, which again, I think is about spilling over, but maybe almost like liberating characters, right? Liberating like historical Indigenous Métis, these folks that are celebrated in history or perhaps not celebrated, and to kind of like play around in a respectful way. But this idea of sort of liberating folks almost from the predetermined notions that, like, what's written about Louis Riel, spoiler alert, is a character in the play. So find out a little bit of like this different interpretation of historical figures, I think, in kind of like letting loose in a spilling over way. And so, dramaturgically, I think if you read this piece, you'll sort of see that there's, a game at play. There's certain like cycles that happen throughout this piece. And so it's really quite funny. It's exciting. It's new. And it was one that brought me joy and made me laugh a lot. And I was so happy to see that now it's published and the folks can read it. So I recommend it for sure.
That's awesome. Awesome. Thank you. Isidra Cruz.
Despite my initial I actually had something. So I recommend This Place. 150 Years Retold. It is a graphic novel anthology of work by Indigenous artists from storytellers from across this country. And, it looks at our 150 years. This came out sort of around the Canada 150, but it looks at our history through our eyes and the stories that people don't hear. And so like my favorite one is called Annie of the Red River. And it's about Annie Ballantine, who was just like this badass woman who did not take shit from the men around her, and including white men. And she stood up for her people and for her rights in a time when, as an Indigenous woman, she had none. So, those are the kind of stories you don't necessarily get to hear, from history classes. Well, we weren't in the history books for a long time. So, but those are not the stories we always get to hear. And so that's what I love about this. And also, I'm a bit of a comic book nerd. I love my graphic novels. There's just something about graphic novels that is able to sort of bridge sort of a space in your mind. And for somebody who's more of a visual learner, that helps very much. So absorbing these stories, is that being able to see that and like interpret and feel that. So I'm always like, yeah. And there's a lot of Indigenous graphic novel artists who are coming out and who've been releasing work. And it's not just, as what was said was, when a lot of writers are starting out with like playwrights, especially, it's based sort of in this trauma. And I think artistically we're moving past sort of the trauma and into the the next part. And that's what's exciting about these stories.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Isidra. Donna Michelle, come back to us.
Hi. I wanted to let you know that Joelle is recommending Wab Kinu's young adult novel, Walking in Two Worlds, which touches on Indigenous youth suicide ideation and is a good read.
Yes. Yeah, it is. But I'm surprised that that was her choice. I didn't know because, of course, this all just happened very recently. Lori Marchand.
Well, I struggled with the assignment. I read a lot of plays. I know that won't surprise anybody. Um, after I read um, Lee's book, and I spent the weekend sort of walking out on the land and um, just thinking about all that she had to say, thinking about the amazing artists that I've had the privilege to work with throughout my career, and the voices that inspired me. And um, there were two things, and I have to admit, one of the first novels that came to mind was a book that she talks about in the book called Daughters of Copper Women. It is written by a
Sorry
white woman.
to interrupt, Lori. I
Yeah.
missed the name of that. Could you repeat the title?
Yes, Daughters of Copper Woman.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes. So I wanted to contextualize it a little bit because it was a book that I read in the 80s. It was published in 1981. It starts with a foreword because I had all the trepidation of reading a book by a white woman, but you know, she starts by saying that she had permission, and I have to say that as a young woman in the 80s, it was kind of the first novel that I ever read that actually told stories that reflected how I saw the world and how I had lived in the world, how I had experienced the world. And I think that Lee handles it well when talking about appropriation, and it's a struggle because I think they're important stories, and how there isn't another place to access those stories now unless we do that. So it like I said, it's tough. It is tough. I don't know if people are curious, maybe taking it out from the library. um, uh, and like I say, when thinking about a piece of writing that really influenced both my professional and personal life was, in fact, another document that you can just read. It's free online, called the Laurier Memorial. It is a document that was created by the three nations of the interior Salish, the Syilx, or the Okanagan, the Shukwatin, and the Qatin. And it was presented to Sir Wilfrid Laurier in Kamloops, where I grew up in two cities, in Ottawa, both river cities, in Ottawa and in Kamloops. And it was presented to Sir Wilfrid Laurier in Kamloops in 1910. And it tells the stories of the 100 years prior to that date of contact. And it talks about our protocols of hospitality and of welcome, and how important the land and the food was to sustaining our communities, and our responsibility to take care of the entire community, and talking about land, like countering the idea of land being owned by privately owned. It ends by saying, basically to the government, to the prime minister of the time, saying, you've defaulted on all of your promises. And in reading it, even now, 112 years later, there's more math for you, Lindsay. Everything is so relevant. Everything is so relevant. And the really beautiful thing about it that I think is really important to read and understand is the concept of time. Is, often in our land acknowledgements, whoever's given them will talk about being here from time immemorial. And it is absolutely crystal clear in this document that 100 years is a drop of water. It's a drop of sand on a massive beach. And talking about the patience of our people waiting to have the government honor agreements and to do right by the Indigenous people of this land who extended hospitality, extended welcome, and frankly, in terms of honoring Indigenous knowledge, just without that knowledge, those first colonial people who arrived would have died. They would have died. And anyway, it is talking about that patience and that time, which is something that I think in the current context we lose sight of. I'm not suggesting that we be more patient, but it is a greater view. It is a really long view to the challenge that's in front of us, and I think it gives some understanding to also the hill in front of us, right? And to fight those moments of feeling lost and feeling vulnerable and feeling like, how do we find the energy to keep going? And it's always, for me, it's always the inspiration of the elders, again, with whom I've had the honor to work with and to have had inform me, to inform how I am in this world. And it is just knowing that, anything that we accomplish here is because of the work of those that have come before us.
That's great, Lori. Thanks. I hear you about Daughters of Copper Woman, because my first book was The Bear Who Stole the Chinook, which was also collected stories. As you can see, Shakespeare on Saskatchewan is ramping up for curtain. So things are about to get like wild here. I'm like, Crystal, turn down the music. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Crystal Peterson's here. So I'm going back to the source for mine. I was looking for so many things, listening to all of you ran through my head, but I'll go back to the source for me, which is Maria Campbell, and the book of Jessica, which is everything, was such an important book for me. So it's kind of a cheat because there's a play in it, as well as the memoir, as well as the conversation between Maria and Linda Griffiths about the making of the play Jessica, essentially from the source material of Half-Breed, which for me was transformational, because as a half-breed kid in Winnipeg with no access to any Indigenous artists at that point, and then there was Half-Breed, and then there was Jessica, and I have given away dozens and dozens of the book of Jessica, because for me it is everyone who's talking about reconciliation, and everybody who's talking about, I want to work with Indigenous folks on something, I'm like, you should read this, because it's like a primer on what not to do, as well as ways forward, because Maria and Linda leaned in to that, and they made the story, they made the play, and I think all of those lessons in that book still hold as we move forward some way towards some kind of, I'm making air quotes, reconciliation. Lindsay wants to say something, I can tell.
I do. Well, I just pulled it off the shelf, and then I also noticed it's a red dress. Isn't that so? I never seen that before. This is, yeah. I don't think this is the original publication, but I know this isn't the reissue. So this is definitely right. Published before.
It was,
The red
and
dress.
there's the story of the red material in
The
in
shawl,
the book,
right? It was a shawl, I think.
So, yeah, it's all for me. That is the source. Going back to Maria, going back to that story. Yeah, how we look back, and in order to move forward. It's going to get wild here, friends. So unless someone has something else that burning that they need to say, I just want to say miigwech, chi miigwech, for taking the time to come and have this conversation, for reading the books, for having ideas. It's so nice to see your faces. I definitely win for location though, because I'm outside on the river. DM, is there anything you wanted to say to wrap?
Thanks, Yvette. Thanks, everybody. I echo Yvette's thanks to you all for your thoughts and for bringing the insides of those books out so that I can go boldly back into them with some more context. And yeah, all those thoughts around identity and community and pursuit of joy are really informative for us as we move through this Justice Forum and towards the first stone. We're hoping that these conversations help us to move into a thoughtful practice of art and also of humanity with each other. We're going to keep trying to be good people doing good things. Well, there's a couple more sessions that are TBD. We'll let folks know about those as we can. As always, we're so thankful to our guests here today, to the behind the scenes folks, to Heather Bellingham and Max C. Farron, and to Lindsay N. Black. And we are thankful also to the Canada Council for supporting this iteration of the Community Justice Forum. Thanks for being part of it. See you around. Night, beauties.